Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The eyes of the portrait. The estate loomed over me like a silent predator as I stepped out of my car, the old stone walls cloaked in ivy and shadows. Its Gothic spires reached into the twilight sky, casting long, twisted shapes across the driveway. I hadn't been back here in years, not since my childhood. My aunt, Edith, was the last to live here, and after her passing, the house had been left in a silent state of decay, waiting for someone to claim it. That someone, unfortunately, was now me. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the darkened hallway lined with heavy drapes, the dim light filtering through in thin, hazy strands. Dust motes hung in the air, stirred by my movement as I stepped into the house. I felt a strange weight in the air, something thick and unsettling. The silence here was unnatural, as though even the walls were holding their breath. It wasn't the house I remembered from my childhood. No, something here had changed, and it was watching me. As I wandered through the house, memories flickered like fireflies, faded scenes of me darting through these halls, playing hide and seek with shadows. In the dining room, my gaze was drawn to the large, ornate portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was of my great-grandfather, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I moved. The candlelight cast eerie shadows on his face, making his expression flicker between stern and sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying me with a silent intensity, as if gauging my worth, or perhaps my weakness. Uncle Lawrence, the eyes, I murmured to myself, remembering how my cousin used to say that our ancestors' eyes would blink if you stared too long. It was only a story, wasn't it? But as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw his gaze shift, just the slightest tilt of the head in the corner of my eye. I laughed it off as nerves, yet the unease gnawed at me, lingering even as I forced myself away from the unsettling portrait. That night, as I lay in my childhood room, shadows danced across the walls, cast by the faint light of the moon outside. My eyes drifted closed, but then I heard it, a faint, soft padding, almost like footsteps, coming from down the hall. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. There it was again, slow, deliberate steps, growing closer. I clutched the blankets, a chill sweeping over me as the sound stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. The footsteps didn't fade, nor did the door open. Silence, but not peace. Just as I thought I could calm down, I heard it, the whisper of fabric brushing against wood, a heavy exhale right outside. I summoned the courage to reach for the door and yank it open, my heart thudding wildly. But the hallway was empty. Empty, save for the dark outline of my great-grandfather's portrait, half hidden in the shadows at the end of the hall. His eyes glinted in the darkness, sharp and aware, as if he had been the one watching me all along. I retreated back to my bed, trying to rationalize it as an old house creaking, settling into the night. But as I lay there, I realized one thing with bone-chilling certainty. I was not alone in this house, and the soft padding of footsteps hadn't disappeared. It was only waiting. The next morning, the events of the night felt like a feverish memory, blurred by the unforgiving morning light streaming in through my window. But the unease clung to me, like a damp fog that refused to lift. The house was strangely silent, oppressive, as though I was a trespasser in some ancient creature's lair. I wanted to convince myself that it was only an old house with creaky floorboards, that the footsteps were just my imagination. But the portrait's eyes haunted me, lurking in the back of my mind like a terrible, uninvited thought. Determined to shake off the dread, I made my way to the kitchen to prepare some coffee. That's when I noticed a small, odd smudge on the polished wooden floor of the hallway. It was a perfect circle, faintly dusty, as if someone had left a heavy boot print and then brushed it away. The thing was, I hadn't been in the hallway since last night. An uneasy thrill crept up my spine as I crouched down, tracing the smudge with my fingers. That's when I heard a voice. "Still wandering around, are we?" A low, raspy voice echoed from the far end of the hall. I froze, slowly lifting my gaze. There, barely visible in the dimness, was the silhouette of a woman, her hair long and wispy, her face concealed in shadow. I stifled a gasp, blinking rapidly, but as soon as I focused, she was gone. My heart pounded as I staggered to my feet, questioning my sanity. I hadn't heard anyone else in the house. No one had come through the door since I arrived. Yet there it was, that unmistakable feeling of being watched, of something unseen observing my every move. I backed away, my breath quickening, but a strange compulsion drew me back to the dining room, to that damned portrait hanging above the fireplace. As I stared at my great-grandfather's face, those cold, unreadable eyes seemed to laugh, mocking my fear. Unable to hold back any longer, I muttered, "Who are you? Why are you haunting me?" My voice echoed slightly, swallowed by the vastness of the empty room. I half expected an answer. Instead, a soft creaking came from the floorboards above me, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing. Footsteps that mirrored my heartbeat, growing louder and closer, descending the staircase as if drawn to my voice. With a chill, I turned to see a dark figure at the top of the stairs, shrouded in shadow, half-formed in the faint light spilling through the window. My breath caught, and the figure simply stared. It looked like my great-grandfather, but something was wrong. His face was twisted, distorted, like an oil painting smudged by careless hands. The figure raised one bony hand and pointed at me, a long, thin finger shaking as if with age. Or rage. I blinked, and just like that, the figure vanished, leaving only the empty stairwell and the faint echo of those footsteps. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and the portrait seemed to glow in the dim light, his eyes following me once more, darker and more menacing. I could almost hear a whisper on the edge of my thoughts, "You don't belong here." Panicking, I ran up to my room and locked the door, gasping for breath. But as I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen, I heard it, the soft, slow padding of footsteps down the hallway, coming closer, inch by inch. My mind raced, each sound heightening the terror as they stopped, right outside my door. I spent the entire day trying to avoid that hallway, the portrait, and any place in the house where the shadows seemed too deep or the light too dim. But as the hours dragged on, I realized there was no escape. The air grew heavy with something foul and unseen, thick with the smell of damp earth and old wood. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on me, watching every movement, every breath. By dusk, I could barely stand it. I found myself back in the dining room, staring up at my great-grandfather's portrait, his grim expression sharper, more sinister, as if daring me to leave. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, feeling foolish for talking to a painting. But I could have sworn his mouth curved into a mocking sneer, the glint in his eyes growing darker. In the silence that followed, I heard a faint whisper, so close I could feel the chill of it against my skin. "Do you think you're alone, child?" The voice slithered through the room like smoke, curling around me. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I looked around, searching for the source. But the room was empty, completely and utterly empty. I took a step back, desperate to flee, but the whisper came again, closer this time, right next to my ear. "We see you. We've always seen you." I spun around, but no one was there. Just the echo of that voice, fading into the walls like a memory. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard, and that's when I saw it. Peeking out from beneath a warped floorboard was an old, tattered piece of parchment. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I knelt down, prying it loose, and held it up to the fading light. It was a letter, the ink smeared and faded, written in a shaky hand. "I am trapped," it read. "He watches, waiting to be released. Do not look into his eyes. Do not stay too long. Or you will join us, unseen and unheard, forever." The words blurred as a chill ran down my spine. My mind reeled, and I stumbled back, gripping the letter as though it were my only lifeline. But then I felt it, a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I gasped, whipping around, but no one was there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away, trembling, and my gaze fell on the portrait once more. My great-grandfather's face had changed, it was almost skeletal now, his eyes hollow and black, staring at me with a ravenous hunger. The corners of his mouth were twisted in a cruel, knowing grin. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that filled the room, surrounding me. Desperate, I bolted toward the stairs, my mind screaming for escape. But with each step I took, the footsteps followed, closer and louder. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her, the same woman I'd glimpsed in the hallway. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide with terror. "Don't go in there," she whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes fixed on the portrait downstairs. He'll trap you, just like the others. Who? Who is he? I stammered, but she vanished before I could get an answer. Alone, breathless, and terrified, I pressed myself against the wall, as the footsteps echoed up the stairs, closer and louder. And then, as if something were pushing me forward, my gaze fell on the far end of the hallway, back to my bedroom, where the door stood wide open, waiting. I stepped into my room, heart racing, the wall seeming to close in as I crossed the threshold. The air was thick, heavy with the same damp scent I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, suffocating. Shadows gathered in the corners, twisting and merging into shapes I couldn't quite make out. My own reflection in the mirror on the far wall looked strange, almost unfamiliar, as if something was watching me from behind my own eyes. I sank onto the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breath, but my gaze kept drifting to the hallway. The door creaked slowly, a soft groaning sound that sent shivers down my spine as it closed behind me. In the silence that followed, I heard it, the faint, unmistakable scratching, like nails dragging along wood, moving closer. And then came a familiar voice, whispered but thick with malevolence, a voice that made my stomach twist. "Did you think you could escape, child?" It murmured. I recognized it as the voice I'd heard in the dining room, the voice that slithered around me, clinging to my thoughts. It was my great-grandfather's voice, somehow more menacing, deeper and rougher, as if pulled from beyond the grave. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to break free of this nightmare, but the scratching continued, creeping closer until it was right outside the door. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, clutching the crumpled letter I'd found earlier. Desperation clawed at me, and I tried to remember the words, the warnings etched in that shaky handwriting. "Do not look into his eyes," I whispered, but my own voice trembled, breaking. The warning felt flimsy, like a torn page from a forgotten book, unable to shield me from whatever had trapped me here. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. There, in the dimness, stood the figure of my great-grandfather, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow and endless. Shadows clung to him, swirling around his form as he took a step into the room. His eyes, black as obsidian, glistened with a terrible hunger, a need that sent chills through me. I tried to look away, but his gaze caught me, held me like a vice. "Join us," he said, his voice a rasp, echoing with the despair of countless others. "No," I managed, choking on the word, but my body betrayed me, paralyzed by his gaze. His eyes seemed to sink deeper, pulling me in, devouring any last shred of hope I clung to. The room around me blurred, and suddenly, I was no longer standing in my bedroom but in a darkened corridor, lined with countless portraits, each one twisted, each one of a face frozen in terror. They all stared down at me, their hollow eyes pleading, trapped in an endless nightmare. And then, as if by some unseen hand, I felt myself pulled toward the empty space on the wall, a blank canvas waiting. My great-grandfather's hand reached toward me, cold as death, his fingers pressing against my shoulder. I looked up, desperate, but as my eyes met his, a cold realization settled in. I was to become one of them, a mere specter trapped in his cursed gaze, another soul locked away in silence, forever. His voice whispered one last time, filling the darkness around me. "You look too long." The last thing I saw was his face, twisted into a satisfied grin, as everything faded to black. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Nameless Pages. It started on a drizzly Thursday evening, the type of night that doesn't quite feel real, with fog draping the streets like a heavy, gray cloak. I'd been wandering through the city, my mind still fogged from a recent breakup, when I saw it, a tiny, darkened bookshop tucked between two boarded-up buildings. I don't know what compelled me to enter, maybe the flickering sign above the door that read bygone tomes, or maybe just the thought of escaping the drizzle for a while. Either way, I stepped in, and the bell over the door jingled, as if announcing my arrival to ghosts long forgotten. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, with shelves crammed full of books piled to the ceiling. A musty scent filled the air, almost chokingly so, as though these books hadn't been disturbed in decades. At the far end of the shop, a figure huddled behind a counter. An old man, skeletal and stooped, peered at me from beneath bushy white brows. His gaze was unnervingly piercing, like he could see right through me. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice crackling as if he hadn't spoken in years. I muttered something about looking around. but his gaze held mine a moment longer before he simply nodded and gestured toward the rows of books. My eyes scanned the titles, most of them too worn to make out. As I wandered further into the depths of the store, I felt something odd, a prickling on the back of my neck, as if the silence itself was watching me. Then, on a shelf near the back, I found it, a leather-bound book with no title, its cover cracked and fraying. I reached out, and my fingers brushed the cover. The sensation was sharp and sudden, like touching ice. A small voice in the back of my mind told me to pull away, to leave the book alone, but curiosity is a strong force. When I opened it, the pages were blank, at first. Then, almost as if they'd been waiting for me, words began to appear. The ink faded in slowly, forming phrases that looked as if they'd been handwritten by someone long ago. But what struck me most wasn't the writing itself, it was the familiarity of it. The words seemed to mirror my own recent thoughts, as if someone had transcribed my life onto the pages. "That one's not for sale," the old man's voice came, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the book. He'd appeared soundlessly behind me, his thin lips pressed in a tight line. "Why not?" I asked, almost breathless, clinging to the book instinctively. He paused, his gaze hardening. "Because it's not meant for you." But I didn't leave it behind. Against his wishes, something drove me to slip it under my coat as I paid for a random paperback, hoping he wouldn't notice. The thrill of taking it, of having something so seemingly forbidden, overwhelmed any guilt I might have felt. The old man simply watched as I exited, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if he knew exactly what I had done. Once outside, I hurried home, rain soaking me through as I clutched the book tight against my chest. When I got back to my apartment, I threw off my coat and sat down to examine the book more closely. With trembling fingers, I opened it again, and this time, the words were clear, crisp, and legible. The story began with a character, unnamed, who was alone in a dark, decaying city. Oddly enough, this city bore uncanny similarities to my own neighborhood. The streets were described with a familiarity that made my heart race. Details of my local coffee shop, the small grocery store, even my apartment's exterior were woven into the pages as if someone had watched me, followed me, and then written it all down. I told myself it was coincidence. That someone in the past must have lived a similar life. Yet, as I read further, each detail felt too precise, too deeply personal. Then, I reached the final paragraph of the first chapter, where the character stumbles upon a bookshop just like the one I'd visited. And there, on the last line of the page, were words that made my blood run cold. The nameless book that had called to him was now in his hands, just as it had been in mine. That night, I hardly slept. The book lay on my bedside table, its leather cover seeming to pulse in the darkness, almost like a heartbeat. The storm outside rattled the window panes, and shadows danced on the walls, twisting and stretching in unsettling shapes. I kept glancing at the book, as though it might suddenly open on its own. When dawn finally broke, gray and overcast, I couldn't resist any longer. I needed to know what happened next in the story. With shaky hands, I opened the book again. The pages, slightly yellowed and brittle, almost seemed to hum under my fingertips. The story picked up exactly where I'd left off, following the protagonist who was now losing sleep, haunted by strange, unexplainable sounds in his apartment. I swallowed hard, goosebumps rising on my arms. I'd heard the same strange sounds last night, the quiet, repetitive tapping on the walls, the faint whisper of something just outside my door. As I read on, I couldn't ignore the way the character's actions mirrored mine, his every thought aligning with my own creeping dread. The story twisted, describing how he would often see fleeting figures in the mirrors, reflections that didn't quite match his own. My stomach twisted as I remembered catching glimpses of my reflection in the dimness of my apartment, wondering if it was slightly off. The character in the book was growing increasingly paranoid, and each page seemed to document his steady descent. There was a brief section where he confronts the shadows, asks them outright what they want. The reply chilled me to my core: "We are only waiting." A chill ran through me as my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was my friend Mark, someone I hadn't seen in a while. "Hey," he said cheerily, "just checking in. Haven't heard from you in days." "Yeah, sorry. I just found this weird book," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know, it's strange. It feels like it's talking to me." It even describes this area, my apartment, everything. Creepy, Mark laughed nervously. Well, if you want some company, maybe I could swing by? Might help you sleep. I hesitated, glancing over at the book. A surge of unease held me back. No, it's fine. I'll be okay. Suit yourself, man. Just don't get too lost in it, Mark said before hanging up. I returned to the book, flipping forward in hopes of breaking the odd connection I felt. I'd barely read a line when I froze. The character, alone in his apartment, receives a call from a friend he declines to see, just as I had. Heart pounding, I closed the book, barely able to process the words that seemed to narrate my exact actions. That night, the tapping on my walls returned, louder this time, a rhythmic, deliberate sound that echoed through my tiny apartment. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the book in both hands, wondering if I should destroy it or throw it into the streets. But something stopped me, as if I wasn't meant to be rid of it. Instead, I found myself asking aloud, "What do you want?" The tapping stopped instantly. Silence filled the room, thick and smothering. My heart hammered as I waited, barely daring to breathe. Then, a soft, hissing whisper echoed back from nowhere, as though the walls themselves were responding, "You." The next morning, I was certain I'd imagined it. The tapping, the voice, everything. But as I stumbled into the bathroom and caught my reflection in the mirror, something felt wrong. My face looked pale and hollow, eyes sunken as though I hadn't slept in days. Worse yet, for just a second, I thought my reflection lingered, looking back at me with a twisted grin that I hadn't made. My heart raced, and I turned away, cursing myself for being paranoid. In the living room, the book lay on my coffee table, waiting. I considered throwing it out, burying it in the trash, but a strange compulsion kept me from doing so. Against all logic, I opened it again, expecting the pages to continue where they left off. But they hadn't. Instead, an entirely new chapter had appeared, one that I hadn't seen before. The words were slightly smudged, as if hastily written, but the first line was crystal clear. Once he asked what they wanted, the shadows grew bold. My stomach twisted as I read on. The story recounted a night that eerily resembled the last. The character had asked the same question, and since then, shadows seemed to follow him, lurking in the corners, appearing where they shouldn't. He'd spot figures standing behind him in mirrors or reflected in windows, watching, waiting. I could practically feel eyes on me as I read. It was as if the words weren't just telling a story, they were creating my reality, page by page. A knock on my door pulled me from the text, and I jumped, my nerves frayed. Peering through the peephole, I saw Mark, looking concerned. "I brought coffee," he said, holding up 2 cups when I opened the door. "You sounded off yesterday. Thought I'd check in." "Thanks," I mumbled, taking the cup and glancing back at the book. "There's something really wrong with this thing, Mark. It's like it knows what I'm doing. Everything I read, it happens." Mark raised an eyebrow, half skeptical, half amused. "You're just psyching yourself out. But here, let me see this creepy book of yours." I hesitated but handed it to him. He flipped through the pages, brow furrowing. "Looks like a normal old book to me." "There's nothing written here," he said, frowning. I stared at him, stunned. I snatched the book back, and sure enough, the pages were blank. Not a single word. "Wait." It was full of writing, I began, my voice trembling. Mark laughed, though it sounded strained. "Dude, get some rest. You're seeing things." But I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his gaze darted around the room before he gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder and left. The silence after he'd gone was almost tangible, pressing in around me. I sat there, book open on my lap, staring at the empty pages until, gradually, words began to appear again. I watched, horrified, as the new chapter described Mark's visit, down to the coffee cups, his laughter, and the reassuring pat on my shoulder. But then, something else appeared, a line about Mark, his face twisted in fear, standing in a dark alleyway, watching as shadows reached for him. The breath caught in my throat. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. Was it trying to show me what would happen next? Or Had I caused it? I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing Mark's number, but it went straight to voicemail. "Mark, please call me back." "Don't go anywhere alone," I stammered, barely able to get the words out. "Stay somewhere bright. Don't go anywhere dark." The phone slipped from my hands as I looked back down at the book, dreading what I might see if I opened it again. But some horrible curiosity drove me to lift the cover, if only to confirm my worst fears. And there, in stark, dark letters, was a single sentence that filled me with dread: "The shadows are coming." By now, every corner of my apartment felt like it was closing in, shadows creeping into spaces where light should have been. My heart hammered as I forced myself to read on, each word clawing its way into my mind, leaving icy trails behind. The new chapter was darker than anything before. It described a feeling of helplessness, of watching something awful unfold with no power to stop it. In the story, Mark's face was twisted in terror as shadows pooled around him, his screams echoing through empty streets. I gripped the book, horrified. No, it can't be real," I muttered, standing up so fast I nearly knocked over the coffee table. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Mark again. Still, no answer. An image flashed in my mind, Mark alone in a dark alley, something closing in on him. I felt as if the book was daring me to read more, as if each page held a truth I couldn't avoid. Against my better judgment, I opened it again, feeling its weight like a curse in my hands. The words were relentless, vivid. They described my search for Mark, my panic growing as I realized I was too late. Every dark corner, every shadowed place seemed alive, breathing with some unseen malice. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, a text message from Mark: "Help. Can't see. Everything's dark." I could barely breathe as I read his words. The room around me seemed to blur, darkness creeping into my vision. I stumbled to the door, barely aware of grabbing my coat and keys. Outside, the world felt strangely muted, streetlights casting long, unnatural shadows that flickered and swayed as if they were alive. I sprinted through the empty streets, my breath coming in gasps, feeling like I was being watched with every step. Mark's text had come from the old part of town, near the bookstore. My mind raced, questions swirling. Had he gone there because of the book? Because of what he saw in my apartment? As I neared the alley, an overwhelming sense of dread took hold of me. There, barely illuminated by a dim streetlight, I saw a figure hunched over, shadows twisting around him like living tendrils. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice strangled. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't him. Or rather, it wasn't him anymore. The figure turned, and where his eyes should have been, there was only darkness, swirling, hungry darkness that seemed to stretch out toward me. "Why did you bring it here?" He, or it, whispered, his voice hollow, echoing from some other place. "You read it. And now it wants you." I staggered back, heart racing, unable to tear my gaze from the thing that had once been my friend. Shadows clawed out from him, snaking across the ground, pulling toward me. In a blind panic, I yanked the book from my pocket and threw it at him, hoping, praying, that breaking the connection would end this nightmare. The book landed at his feet, and for a second, everything went still. Then, a low, rumbling laugh echoed from within the shadows. "You cannot rid yourself of me so easily," it said, as Mark's twisted figure dissolved, leaving the book open on the ground, pages fluttering wildly in a breeze that shouldn't have existed. Terrified, I glanced down. The words on the pages were forming again, scrawling across like ink bleeding through water. The last sentence, clear and final, read, "As one story ends, another begins. You cannot escape, for now you are the next chapter." And then, before my eyes, the letters began to fade, only to reappear on the back of my hands, scrawling up my arms, whispering, waiting. "Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories." Story 3. The Whispering Veil. The house was colder than I remembered, and the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in the silence of the night. I hadn't been back to the estate since my grandmother's funeral a decade ago, and yet, the place looked unchanged, frozen in the moments of my childhood nightmares. Dust lay thick across every surface, and the smell of damp would fill the air. I should have turned back the moment I set foot inside, but something in that old letter, her last letter, had drawn me here, whispering of promises and long-buried secrets. I could almost feel her presence, watching. My cousin Sarah trailed behind me, reluctant and muttering under her breath. She had always hated this place. "Why'd you bring me here, Marco?" she asked, looking over her shoulder as if someone might be lurking in the shadows. I forced a smile, trying to hide the unease that gnawed at me. "I found a letter. From her. She said there was something she wanted me to find." The words felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me. I didn't mention the parts that seemed written in haste, as if she'd been trying to warn me of something before her words ran out. Sarah shook her head, crossing her arms as we moved deeper into the house. I remember her stories. Ghosts? Things she said hid in the walls. "You don't really believe all that, do you?" The floorboards creaked in response, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind. "It's just the house settling," I mumbled, more to reassure myself than her. But the shiver that ran down my spine betrayed me. The whisper was real. And worse, it seemed to carry my name. A sudden crash echoed through the silence, and both Sarah and I jumped. My heart pounded as I followed the noise to the parlor where a cracked mirror had fallen, its glass webbed with deep fractures. We both stared, transfixed. "Marco!" a voice whispered, soft and venomous. It was a mere breath on the edge of silence, yet every syllable burned with an icy clarity. Did you hear that?" I whispered, my mouth dry as I gripped Sarah's arm. She nodded, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and for a second, I thought I could feel someone's icy fingers trailing over my skin. The room darkened, and in the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, barely distinguishable from the walls themselves, shifting and flickering in the dim light. "Marco! There's something here," Sarah's voice wavered, pulling me from my frozen stance. I forced myself to move, pulling her closer as I looked around. The house had always been strange, but I had never felt it this. Alive. Something in those whispers felt familiar, almost like a memory clawing its way back to me, a promise left unfinished. The shadows seemed to gather in the room, thickening until they coalesced into a figure in the corner. A frail woman's form, her face obscured in the darkness, but her eyes burned with a pale fire. Her lips moved, but no sound followed. And yet, in my mind, her voice echoed, "You broke your promise, Marco." I stumbled back, almost tripping over a loose floorboard as the figure in the shadows took form. She looked like my grandmother, but twisted, her frame frail, bent, with hands clawed and reaching toward me. Her skin was sallow, tight against her bones, and those eyes, once so warm, now shone with a feverish hatred. Her lips moved soundlessly, yet her voice filled my mind, each word laced with bitterness. "You left me here, Marco. You promised you wouldn't." The accusation struck me hard. I vaguely remembered making a promise as a child, but the details eluded me. I glanced at Sarah, whose face was pale, her eyes transfixed on the figure in horror. Do you see her too?" I whispered, hoping, somehow, that my eyes were betraying me. "See her?" Sarah's voice was barely a breath. "She's looking right at you, Marco. She knows you." Her words rattled, filled with terror. The figure took a step closer, the air around her thickening, growing colder with each step. I could feel my breath hitch, my heart hammering as her voice pierced through me again, stronger now, echoing in the hollow space of my mind. "You promised to keep me safe. To remember. But you left me to rot." Images flashed in my mind, moments I had long buried, moments of my grandmother speaking in that same parlor, telling me stories of the strange history that surrounded our family. "This house is old," she'd once said, her voice trembling with something close to fear. "It's seen things, harbors things. You must never forget." "I didn't know," I whispered, my words feeble. "I was just a kid. I didn't understand." The figure's expression twisted, her once kind face now seething with fury, as if my words only deepened her pain. "Do you know what she's talking about?" Sarah hissed, her grip tight on my arm, almost bruising. "Marco, we have to get out of here. She's not really Grandma anymore." I wanted to leave too, to turn and run from that house, but something held me there. The promise, whatever it had been, bound me. If I leave, I'll be breaking it again, I muttered, more to myself than to Sarah. And as if reading my mind, the figure's lips pulled back in a smile that froze the blood in my veins. You're right, the voice purred. You can't leave. Not until you make things right. The lights in the room flickered, and as they did, her image began to distort, her body stretching and bending in unnatural angles, until she was almost unrecognizable. Her mouth widened in a silent scream, filling my head with a piercing static that drowned out every thought. Desperate, I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back into the hallway. We need to find something, anything she left behind. Maybe it'll help her move on. I had no idea if it would work, but I clung to the idea like a lifeline. The whispering voice grew louder as we ran through the dark corridors, and the walls seemed to pulse around us, breathing in sync with the unnatural sound. We found ourselves in a room at the end of the hall, my grandmother's old study. Papers were strewn everywhere, as if a struggle had taken place. And then I saw it, a box, dust-covered and locked. Something about it called to me, urging me to open it. Inside, there might be the answer, maybe a key to the promise I'd long forgotten. But as I reached for it, a voice thundered through the room, her voice. You were meant to remember, Marco. Remember the price of betrayal. And as her words rang out, the room grew darker, and I could feel her presence closing in around us, trapping us within the memory of her wrath. My fingers trembled as I lifted the box, feeling its weight, a leaden, oppressive presence as if it held more than just objects, as if it bore the weight of all my grandmother's rage and grief. Sarah hovered close, her face ghostly pale in the dim light. Are you sure you want to open that? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum in the room, a hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. We have no choice, I murmured. Whatever she wants. It's tied to this. With a deep breath, I ran my thumb over the rusty latch, forcing it open. The lock resisted, screeching as if reluctant to release whatever lay inside. Finally, with a shudder, it snapped free. I pulled back the lid, and there they were, a stack of brittle letters, bound in an old red ribbon, and a strange, heavy silver amulet. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, but before either of us could speak, a draft seemed to spill into the room, though the windows were shut tight. A bitter chill washed over us, and I heard it again, the whisper of her voice, cutting through the air like shattered glass. Read it, Marco. I looked down at the letter on top, its ink smudged and faded. As I unfolded it, the scrawled words began to reveal their secret, like a curse brought back to life. My dearest Marco, it began, the winds whisper warnings, and shadows watch. If you're reading this, then you've forgotten our pact, and the horrors I warned you of have returned. We share a burden, you and I. You must not forsake me, for this house remembers. The hum grew louder, and suddenly, the walls seemed to darken, the edges of the room shrinking in on us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice laced with panic. Marco, this isn't normal. We need to leave, now. Whatever this is. It's wrong. But I couldn't move, rooted by an odd compulsion, as if my grandmother's voice held me captive. I turned the page, my heart pounding as her words deepened in their warning. To keep you safe, I made a pact with something. Something beyond our world. It saved us for a time, but it demanded loyalty. When I passed, it was to you to carry the promise. The spirit cannot rest without it. Do not abandon me, or it will come for us both. A loud crash echoed from down the hall, and the air filled with the scent of burnt wood. I looked up, my breath hitching, only to see her figure emerging through the doorway, her skeletal face twisted with rage and something else, sorrow. Her gaze fixed on the amulet, the cold glint of metal reflecting in her sunken eyes. The price, she rasped, her voice thick with torment. I paid it once. Now it's your turn. I stumbled back, gripping the amulet. What does she want? Sarah gasped, her voice raw, desperation evident. What does she mean, Marco? I had no answer. But I knew we couldn't stay. I shoved the letters into my pocket, clutching the amulet as I ran out of the study, Sarah close behind. Whatever she bargained with. It's angry. And it's bound to this house. The hallways seemed endless as we ran, twisting in impossible directions, looping back upon themselves. We were trapped. Finally, We burst into the foyer, the front door within reach. But as I reached out, the air thickened, and my fingers froze just inches from the handle. The amulet grew heavy in my hand, almost burning, as my grandmother's voice tore through the silence one last time. You cannot run from the price, Marco. You are bound here, as I was. The door slammed shut, and darkness engulfed us, trapping us in a house with secrets that refused to be silenced. The darkness seemed to swallow us whole, the air thick and suffocating as if the house itself was alive, breathing, and tightening around us. I clutched the amulet so tightly it cut into my palm, the metal warm and pulsing against my skin, like a heartbeat in sync with my own. Sarah was beside me, her breath shallow, her eyes wild as they darted around the foyer. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of light a set of eyes watching us. Marco, Sarah whispered, barely able to speak, what does she mean, about the price? What exactly did she want from you? I shook my head, feeling helpless. The letters had been cryptic, almost incoherent, like someone trying to pass on an ancient riddle with no clear answer. I don't know. I think she bound something to this house, something that kept us safe, but it's angry now. And it wants blood. The words felt foreign, ridiculous, yet the chill that crawled over my skin told me they were true. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and her voice whispered again, soft and venomous, you cannot run from me, Marco. You left me to rot. Now you will pay my debt. I felt her icy touch slide across my neck, sending waves of nausea through me. The shadows around us shifted, twisting and unfurling into grotesque shapes, faces, limbs, and gaping mouths, all writhing in the darkness, watching us with hollow, accusing eyes. No! I shouted, gripping the amulet with both hands. I didn't know. I was just a kid. But my voice seemed to fall into a void, swallowed by the house, by her unrelenting wrath. Beside me, Sarah gripped my arm, tears streaming down her face. She glanced at me, a terrible realization dawning in her eyes. Marco, what if she's not angry at you? But at what she gave herself to? What if she wants you to end it? The thought hit me like a punch. If I didn't uphold her end of the pact, perhaps there was another way to break it. I looked down at the amulet, the cold silver glinting in the dim light, and a memory stirred, a memory of my grandmother's voice, warning me of things that lurked in forgotten places. If it ever breaks loose, she'd said, the only thing that can stop it is you. The shadows thickened, closing in, my grandmother's figure emerging from within them, her once gentle face now twisted in a silent scream. She pointed at the amulet, her eyes burning into mine. I held it up, feeling its weight, the strange pull of it growing stronger. If you want peace, I said, the words scraping out of me, then leave us. I'll break the pact. I'll end it all. The room trembled, the walls pulsing as her figure writhed, fighting some unseen force. But as I raised the amulet high, a new voice, a voice I had never heard before, ancient and deep, rumbled from somewhere within the walls. Break it, and I will feast. All that is bound to me will suffer. The voice was no longer hers, but something else, something older and far more sinister, twisted and monstrous. I felt its pull, its need for blood. I gritted my teeth and slammed the amulet to the ground, shattering it. The silver pieces scattered, a dark, acrid smoke pouring from them as the walls shook violently, cracks spider-webbing through the plaster. The shadowy figure of my grandmother screamed, her face shifting in a final, terrible look of both rage and relief. And then, silence. The darkness faded, the air lightening, and as Sarah and I stumbled to our feet, we found ourselves alone in the house. Everything was still. My grandmother's whispers were gone, her shadow erased. Yet the house seemed emptier, darker, hollow, as if whatever she'd bound had slipped free into the night. We didn't speak as we fled through the door, the weight of what I'd done settling on me. I had broken her pact, released her from her torment, but at what cost? As we crossed the threshold, I thought I heard it, faint and mocking, carried by the wind, a whisper promising that the debt wasn't finished. A debt that would one day return to collect. The house remembers. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.